Have you ever been lying in bed at 2 a.m., replaying a minor conversation from 3 years ago, completely agonizing over a joke that didn't land? Or perhaps you are sitting at your desk right now, surrounded by 4 half-finished projects, 3 empty coffee mugs, and a to-do list that looks less like a plan and more like a ransom note written by your own anxiety. You look at your life and see a pattern of starting with a bang and ending with a whimper. A chronic tendency to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory just as things are starting to get real. If this is your reality, society has likely already handed you a very specific set of labels. They've told you that you're too sensitive, they've branded you a master of none, and they've asked with that subtle, patronizing tilt of the head, why can't you just focus? These labels aren't just insults. They are a psychological curse that forces you to believe you are a failed version of a normal person. You have been raised on a diet of industrial-age productivity advice that treats your brain like a standardized assembly line, and when you can't force your gears to turn in a straight line, you assume the hardware is defective. But as someone who spends their time decoding the messy, beautiful architecture of the human mind, I am here to tell you that the diagnosis you've been given your entire life is fundamentally wrong. You are not broken, you are not lazy, and you are certainly not a failure. You are simply running a high-definition, high-fidelity operating system in a world that was built for low-resolution cogs. We need to stop looking at your self-sabotage as a character flaw and start seeing it as a biological mismatch. What you call distraction, I call being an M-shaped thinker. What you call overwhelmed, I call operating as a supersensor in 8K resolution. This isn't just about positive thinking, it's about a radical shift in your identity. You have been trying to drive a Ferrari through a crowded Starbucks drive-thru and getting frustrated that you keep hitting the curbs. The reason you destroy your own success is often that your brain is literally too powerful for the tiny, narrow boxes society is trying to shove you into. To understand why your brain keeps pulling the emergency brake just as you're gaining speed, we have to look at the actual hardware tucked inside your skull. You see, the standard human brain comes equipped with a very efficient spam filter called latent inhibition. It's like a world-class secretary that deletes 90% of background noise, allowing the average person to ignore the hum of the refrigerator, the pattern on the wallpaper, or the obscure connection between a tree root and a software algorithm. But your brain? Your internal secretary is on a permanent strike. You possess what we call low latent inhibition. Every single piece of sensory data, every flicker of light, every subtext in a conversation, every random idea gets sent straight to your primary inbox with an urgent flag. This is why you get exhausted just going to the grocery store, but it is also precisely why you see the world-altering details that everyone else misses. This sensory flood is compounded by your default mode network, or the DMN. In most people, the DMN is a quiet background hum that only kicks in when they're bored. In you, it is a high-definition IMAX theater that never stops playing. This is the region where your sense of self and your most groundbreaking ideas are formed, but because you process so much data, your DMN is constantly trying to connect the dots in 1,000 directions at once. You aren't unfocused. You are hyper-focused on the entire universe simultaneously. And then there is the third piece of the puzzle, neuroplasticity gone rogue. Because you simulate every possible outcome in high fidelity, your brain often can't distinguish between a thought of failure and an actual physical threat. When you get close to success, your brain simulates the added pressure, the potential for being found out, and the social cost of change so vividly that your amygdala, the brain's ancient smoke detector, sounds a full-scale fire alarm. You aren't sabotaging yourself because you want to fail. You are sabotaging yourself because your brain is trying to save you from a high-resolution disaster that hasn't even happened yet. You are essentially a biological masterpiece that has been trying to follow a manual written for a toaster. And here is the terrifying part. Having the engine of a Ferrari in the frame of a bicycle will tear you apart if you don't know how to drive it. Before we can master this ability, we have to address the dark side of this trait, the part no one wants to talk about. Because this biological gift carries a heavy tax that can leave you profoundly lonely and physically burn out if left unmanaged. This high-resolution tax isn't just a metaphor for a bad day, it is the brutal physiological reality of an engine that has no idle setting. When you are a supersensor, the world doesn't just happen to you, it collides with you. Because you lack that standard issue spam filter, you are perpetually operating in a state of high alert, which leads to a specific kind of profound loneliness. You look at others who seem to navigate the world with such ease, people who can sit in a loud office, eat processed food, and check off a linear to-do list without their soul leaving their body, and you feel like an alien masquerading as a human. You begin to ruminate, and that IMAX theater in your head starts playing a horror movie called Everyone Else Has It Figured Out. This is the moment where the Ferrari engine starts melting the bicycle frame. You experience anhedonia, that gray, hollow numbness where even your brilliant ideas feel like heavy burdens, and you retreat into the ultimate self-sabotage, the safe crouch. You stop trying to succeed because success feels like it will only bring more noise, more expectations, and more sensory data that you simply don't have the RAM to process. You choose the comfort of a small failure over the terrifying exposure of a large victory. And here is the crushing irony. You have been punishing yourself for a trait that is the only reason the human race survived long enough to invent the very society that's now calling you too sensitive. If we zoom out from your personal struggle to the grand scale of human history, we see that your brain type wasn't an evolutionary accident. It was a biological necessity. In the ancient tribe, the normal brains were great for the day-to-day grind, the gathering, the repetitive tasks, the social cohesion. But the tribe needed a super sensor. They needed the person who could notice the one blade of grass moving against the wind, signaling a predator. They needed the deep thinker who could look at the migration patterns of birds and the subtle changes in the soil to predict a drought. You are the descendant of the early warning system. You are the advisor who sees the 3-year consequence of a 3-minute decision. Modern industrialized society is built for the masses, but the masses have always relied on people like you to navigate the wicked environments where the rules change and the stakes are high. You aren't unfocused, you are the sentinel. So how do we stop the sentinel from burning the fort down just to feel some peace? How do we move from being a victim of our hardware to being the architect of a self-sustaining system? We need to install the metamorphosis system, a 3-step biological intervention designed to rig the game in your favor. The first step is what I call the greenhouse strategy for protecting your hardware. You must realize that your Ferrari engine requires a high-octane environment. If you are trying to work in a space with fluorescent lights, constant interruptions, and visual clutter, your prefrontal cortex is wasting 80% of its glucose just trying to not look at the mess. You need to curate a sensory vacuum. Use noise-canceling technology, control your lighting, and implement a zero-input buffer for the first 90 minutes of your day. You are not cleaning your room. You are deactivating the amygdala's smoke detector so the CEO can finally do some strategic work. The second step is the acceptance filter, or the software update. The multitasker's greatest source of self-sabotage is the inability to say no to a new spark of curiosity. Because your brain is a far transfer machine, you see the potential in everything, which leads to decision entropy. To fix this, you need to implement a rigid gatekeeper. You must stop making decisions based on interest and start making them based on legs. In our M-shaped thinker model, you only allow yourself 2 or 3 pillars of mastery at a time. Every other brilliant idea, the urban beekeeping, the 14th century glass blowing, goes into a cold storage notebook. You aren't killing your curiosity, you are placing it in a waiting room. This allows you to say no without the crushing weight of FOMO because you've given your brain a biological guarantee that the idea is safe, but it is not allowed to harvest your current RAM. Finally, we have to address the true reset. Most people think rest is a passive activity, like doom scrolling on TikTok or binge watching a series, but for your brain that is not rest. That is just a different kind of high-fructose sensory overload. Because your DMN is already hyperactive, passive consumption just gives it more attention residue to ruminate on. True recovery for a super sensor must be low input and high fidelity. It looks like staring at a tree, walking in silence, or engaging in a repetitive tactile task like woodworking or knitting that moves the processing from the prefrontal cortex to the basal ganglia. You need to perform a neurological defragmentation where you allow the dots to connect themselves without your conscious ego trying to force the outcome. The self-blame ends today. You were never meant to be a standardized part in a linear machine. You were meant to be the person who weaves the complex threads of our world into a coherent tapestry. You are the elite integrator, the bridge builder, and the super sensor. When you stop surviving your environment and start engineering it, when you stop trying to willpower your way through a biological strike and start honoring the fuel your system actually needs, the self-sabotage evaporates. You move from the dash-shaped life of shallow panic to the M-shaped career of profound impact. You were never broken. You were just a biological masterpiece waiting for the right operating manual. To help you install this first pillar of the metamorphosis system, I have created a resource called the Sentinel's Audit. It is a minimalist framework designed to help you identify your specific sensory triggers and map out your first greenhouse environment in under 15 minutes. You can download it at the link below. I want to hear from you in the comments. What is the most ridiculous thing that has triggered your self-sabotage this week? Let's dismantle those simulations together. And if you are ready to see how this reclaimed focus allows you to master the most wicked career environments of the future, you need to watch our next video on the polymath strategy, where we take this quiet mind and turn it into a high-output engine. Reclaim your sovereignty. Build the bridge. You are watching Cognitive Blueprint.